My name's Tony Clark. I'm having an exhibition here at Buxton Contemporary, and the exhibition is called Unsculpted. I've always wanted the history of art to feature in some way in the work that I was doing. And I feel that in a way that's inevitable and always happens. But in my case, I wanted to foreground it more than a lot of artists would want to do. There are plenty of artists who know a great deal about the history of art, but it's not immediately apparent in the work that they do. I just feel there's a kind of lack in my mind if there isn't some historical underpinning in some way for what I'm doing. I like that sense of a kind of continuity. And I just like the history of art almost like a hobby. You know, if my hobby was gardening, I'd do pictures of gardens. But my hobby, you might say, is the history of art. And so I do pictures that sort of reflect that. But it's neither more nor less, in many ways, than a kind of hobby that I have chosen to put into my artwork. My very earliest pictures were little pictures of buildings. And then I moved from little pictures of buildings to buildings in landscape. And then you could say the landscape took over. But it was a particular type of landscape that really was very prominent in the 17th century in Europe, which were these images of the classical past. One painting that really did influence me a lot was a painting that was, funnily enough, the opposite of what I was doing at the time. My landscapes became more and more about atmosphere and a sort of indefinite space. And then I came across this painting that really was intended to simulate a marble carving on an alabaster ground by Mantegna in the National Gallery in London. And this was a really troubling painting in some ways. I mean, it was a fantastic painting, but I suddenly thought, well, this is an interesting way forward, that you can make a painting that looks a bit like a sculpture, a relief sculpture from the classical world. I mean, that was, Mantegna was one of the really great Renaissance classicists. And it just seemed that because the image was not only a classical one, but also rather quirky and had a background that a lot of people would just see as a sort of strange psychedelic kind of background. And I thought, well, these ingredients have got legs, that there are things that one could do with that idea of a painting as a sort of pseudo-relief sculpture. Almost overnight, I started in the late 80s to make paintings that were my response to that Mantegna painting, even though that resemblance would have to be pointed out to you. But for me, it was key. In the 1970s, a lot of painting had been very much focused on the flat surface of the canvas, that people did paintings that didn't really represent space in any way. And I felt that it would be interesting to see what would happen if you started making paintings that just had a little bit of space in them, that they didn't have a sort of full perspectival space, and they didn't have atmospheric space, but they had this sort of very shallow space that you see in a relief sculpture. And relief sculpture in itself is in a bit of a sort of halfway house position. Is it sculpture or is it two-dimensional? So I liked that it was a kind of in-betweeny area that, as a painter, one could explore. There's also a slightly kind of anti-painting edge to it, that you're not quite happy with painting as itself. The unsculpted idea gave me an opportunity to do something that I'd wanted to do for a long time, which is to take some very small, unambitious drawings that I'd made that could be described as representations of possible sculptures or hypothetical sculptures, and actually have them made into what you could call real sculptures. And I'd worked with Joanne Ritson, a Melbourne artist, for quite a long time in terms of painting, but she also works in 3 dimensions, and she seemed the perfect person to carry out this transformation of a little two-dimensional drawing into a proper three-dimensional sculpture. And I would never in the drawings give much more information than what was going on at the front of the sculpture, and so it was her task to decide about the back of the sculpture, the sides of the sculpture, the colour of the sculpture very often, and the materials and the scale. For a long time, I'd been using 4 specific colours as my kind of default colours, the colours that I could just always start a painting with. If I didn't have any other idea, I could always just go to these 4 colours, which were a light pink, a light blue, a raw sienna brown, and black. And I could always just get going with that. So, for example, I've done a whole series of paintings that are based on imagery from Michelangelo. And that I particularly like doing, partly because there's a precedent for that by the time Michelangelo was an old man, people were copying his work in their work, right, left and centre, and it was almost like a hint to the viewer that, I'm an artist who knows about Michelangelo. And I thought that was a great thing to be able to do, to have that sort of reference. So in a lot of paintings I just continued it, but I looked wider afield. I looked at any sort of historical imagery seemed worth trying in this very restricted range of colours and this restricted relief space. Well, I think the theme of this exhibition has really sort of hit home to me. There's an Italian expression, la grande decorazione. Some people have translated as heroic decoration or heroic frescoes. Seeing it all together, seeing the large work together, reminded me of how important that grand decoration concept was. There's always some kind of historical angle. It doesn't have to be in your face, and it doesn't matter if you don't see it at all, I hope. But it matters to me, and it helps me continue with my work to have that sense of a kind of relationship with a historical precedent.